Jake Martinez sat in the back row of the biology classroom, trying not to draw attention to himself. The chair was too small for his human frame, and his legs felt cramped under the desk. Around him, dozens of alien students chatted quietly as they waited for class to begin. 3 months had passed since Jake arrived at Kepler Station, the biggest school in the galaxy. Students from hundreds of different worlds came here to learn about other species and how to work together in space. Jake was one of only 5 humans at the entire academy, and most days he felt like everyone was watching him. The other students seemed to think humans were boring. They never asked him scary questions or seemed worried about what he might do. Jake had heard some of them call humans the soft ones when they thought he wasn't listening. It didn't bother him much. He was here to learn, not to impress anyone. Professor Veltar floated into the room, his long tentacles carrying data tablets and strange specimens in glass containers. The old Centaurian had taught at the academy for over 200 years, and his knowledge of biology was legendary. His large, wise eyes swept across the classroom as he settled behind his desk. Today we will discuss apex predators, Professor Veltar announced, his voice carrying easily through the room. Every world has creatures that sit at the top of the food chain. These hunters shaped the evolution of all other life on their planets. Jake's desk mate, a crystalline being named Zixara, leaned over and whispered, "This should be interesting. I wonder what the scariest predator in the galaxy is." Professor Veltar activated the holographic display in the center of the room. Images of various alien creatures began to appear, each more impressive than the last. Who would like to share information about the top predator from their homeworld? Several hands shot up immediately. Zixara was called on first. She stood gracefully, her crystal body catching the light and throwing rainbows across the walls. On Felnara, we have the crystal wolves, she said proudly. They can grow as large as your desk, Professor. Their bodies can shift between solid and energy forms, allowing them to pass through walls and surprise their prey. They hunt in packs of 20 or more, and their howls can shatter stone. The class murmured in appreciation. Jake had to admit it sounded pretty scary. He tried to imagine wolves that could walk through walls and decided he was glad Earth didn't have those. Next, Professor Veltar called on Thrum, a massive bear-like creature from the forest world of Dendron. Thump stood slowly, his thick fur rustling as he moved. Even sitting down, Jake could tell Thrum was nearly 8 feet tall. The iron-clawed tree bears rule the forests of my world, Thrum said in his deep, rumbling voice. They are twice my size and can climb the tallest trees as easily as walking on flat ground. Their claws can cut through metal, and they are smart enough to use tools. A single tree bear can hunt prey for weeks, following it through the canopy, without ever touching the ground. More impressed whispers filled the room. Jake glanced around at his classmates and saw genuine fear in their eyes as they imagined such creatures. Even tiny Pipka, who barely reached Jake's knee, had something to contribute. The mouse-like being from Harmony Fields stood on her chair, so others could see her. "We have giant harvest beetles on my world," she squeaked in her high voice. "They are as big as ground vehicles and have mandibles that can slice through our strongest crops in seconds. During harvest season, we must work in groups and carry sonic weapons to keep them away from our fields." Jake listened to each description with growing amazement. Every world seemed to have monsters that would give humans nightmares. He started to feel grateful that Earth seemed so tame in comparison. Professor Veltar's gaze finally fell on Jake. "And what about Earth, Jake? What predators rule your homeworld?" The classroom fell silent. Jake felt dozens of alien eyes focusing on him. He shifted uncomfortably in his too small chair, trying to think of what to say. Most of his classmates expected him to mention something small and harmless. He had overheard conversations where they guessed that Earth's worst predators might be something like angry rabbits or perhaps large insects. The general opinion seemed to be that humans came from a gentle world full of peaceful creatures. Jake thought about bears, lions, tigers, crocodiles, and sharks. He thought about snakes whose bite could kill in minutes and spiders whose venom could drop a grown man. He considered mentioning the time his uncle had been charged by a bull elk during a camping trip. or the mountain lion tracks they had found near his family's cabin last summer. But looking around at his classmates' expectant faces, Jake realized they had no context for understanding what he might tell them. How could he explain that humans regularly hiked through territories where bears and mountain lions lived? How could he describe the casual way his family planned camping trips to places where dangerous animals were just part of the landscape? Well, Jake said slowly, we have several kinds of predators. Bears, big cats, wolves. He trailed off, seeing the confusion on his classmates' faces. They clearly didn't understand why he seemed so calm talking about creatures that sounded dangerous. Professor Veltar made a note on his tablet. Interesting. Perhaps we will explore Earth's ecosystem in more detail in a future lesson. Jake nodded and sank back into his chair, relieved to be out of the spotlight. Around him, conversation resumed as students discussed the various predators they had learned about. But Jake noticed that several of his classmates kept glancing at him with curious expressions. He had a feeling that his brief mention of Earth's predators had raised more questions than it had answered. As class ended and students began filing out, Zixara lingered by Jake's desk. Your bears and cats, she said thoughtfully. Are they very small? Jake considered the question. He thought about the grizzly bear he had seen at Yellowstone last year, standing on its hind legs and towering over the tourists who watched from a safe distance. Not really, he said simply. Zixara's crystal form flickered with confusion, but before she could ask another question, Jake had gathered his materials and headed for the door. He had learned something important today about his fellow students, but he wasn't sure he was ready to share what he had learned about his own world. The hallway buzzed with conversations about the day's lesson, but Jake walked quietly toward his next class, wondering if he would always feel like an outsider among beings who seemed to come from much safer worlds than his own. The Academy's central lounge buzzed with quiet conversation as students from different worlds gathered around floating tables to study together. Jake sat with his usual group, reviewing notes from their morning classes. The space was designed to be comfortable for all species, with adjustable seating and environmental controls that could adapt to different atmospheric needs. Pipka sat across from Jake, her tiny paws holding a data pad that looked enormous in her small hands. Her mouse-like ears twitched as she scrolled through information about different planets. She had been unusually quiet during their study session, clearly focused on something that had caught her interest. Jake, Pipka said suddenly, her high voice cutting through the background noise. I have been reading about your world. Earth has very large bodies of water, correct? Oceans? Jake looked up from his textbook on galactic history. Yeah, that's right. About 70% of Earth's surface is covered by oceans. Zixara's crystalline form shifted color slightly, a sign that she was paying attention. That seems like a lot of water. What is the purpose of having so much? Well, it's not like we planned it that way, Jake said with a small smile. That's just how our planet formed. The oceans are really important for weather patterns, and they support a lot of life. Thrum leaned forward, his massive frame making his chair creak. My people avoid large bodies of water. Our fur becomes too heavy when wet and we sink easily. Do humans enter these oceans? Sure, Jake said casually. Swimming is pretty popular on Earth. Lots of people go to the beach for vacation or to surf or just to cool off when it's hot. The three aliens exchanged glances that Jake didn't quite understand. Pipka's ears drooped slightly and she looked concerned. You willingly enter these large water bodies? Zixara asked slowly. For pleasure? Jake nodded, starting to realize that his friends found this concept strange. Swimming is actually one of the first things most human children learn to do. I learned when I was maybe 4 years old. But what lives in these oceans? Pipka asked, her voice even smaller than usual. On Harmony Fields, our largest water source is Lake Peaceful, and it only contains small filter feeders that eat tiny plants. Even those seem frightening to me when I see them in the water. Jake paused, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. He began to understand why his friends seemed so worried. Their worlds apparently didn't have anything like Earth's marine life. Well, there are lots of different creatures, Jake said carefully. Fish, mostly. Some are pretty small, like the ones you might keep as pets, others are bigger. How much bigger? Thrum asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Well, there are dolphins. They're really smart, probably. As smart as most species in this room. They're about as long as you are tall, Thrum, maybe 8 or 9 feet. They're actually pretty friendly to humans. Pipka made a small squeaking sound. That is larger than my family's entire home. Jake realized he might be scaring his friends, but they seemed genuinely curious. There are also whales. Blue whales are the largest animals on Earth. They can be over 100 feet long. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear conversations from other tables across the lounge. Zixara's crystal body had gone completely clear, which Jake had learned meant she was in shock. 100 feet, Thrum repeated slowly. That is larger than most buildings on my world. They're harmless, though, Jake said quickly. Blue whales eat tiny shrimp-like creatures. They're actually really gentle. People go whale watching just to see them swim by. People go near these creatures on purpose? Pipka whispered. Sure. It's considered really special to see a whale up close. My family went on a whale-watching trip when I was 12. We saw a humpback whale breach completely out of the water. It was amazing. His friends looked at him as if he had just described voluntarily jumping into a volcano. Jake was beginning to understand that their worlds were very different from his. Are there any dangerous creatures in your oceans? Zixara asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid of the answer. Jake hesitated. He thought about how to answer without terrifying his friends, but they were looking at him with such genuine curiosity that he decided to be honest. Well, yes. There are some predators. Predators, Thrum repeated. In the water where humans swim. Most of them don't bother humans, Jake said. The chances of actually encountering something dangerous are really small. But they exist, Pipka said. Yeah, they exist. Zixara leaned forward, her crystal form flickering between different colors. What kind of predators? Jake took a deep breath. He could tell this conversation was going to change how his friends saw both him and his world. Once he said the word, there would be no going back to them thinking of Earth as a peaceful, harmless place. Well, there are sharks. The way Jake said it, with a mixture of respect and casual familiarity, immediately told his alien friends that this was something significant. He hadn't said it the way someone might mention a minor inconvenience. There was weight to the word, a recognition of something serious and powerful. Pipka's data pad slipped from her paws and clattered onto the table. Sharks, she repeated quietly. What is a shark? Thrum asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. Jake looked around at his friends' faces and realized that his answer was going to completely change their understanding of what it meant to be human. They had been thinking of him as a gentle being from a safe world, someone who had never faced real danger. They're predators, Jake said simply. Ocean predators. And humans swim in the same water as these shark predators? Zixara asked. Every day, Jake confirmed. Millions of humans swim in the ocean every day. The three aliens sat in stunned silence. Jake could see them trying to process the idea that humans regularly entered an environment containing creatures called sharks, and that they did this so casually that it was considered normal recreation. Tomorrow, Pipka said slowly. In Professor Feltar's class, will you tell us more about these sharks? Jake nodded, knowing that tomorrow's conversation was going to reveal truths about his world that would shock his friends far more than anything they had heard today. Yeah, he said quietly. I can tell you about sharks. Around them, the lounge continued its normal rhythm of study and conversation, but at their table, 3 alien students sat contemplating the fact that their human friend came from a world where swimming with predators was considered a normal afternoon activity. Jake finished his sandwich and tried not to think about how his friends would react when they learned that sharks were just the beginning. Professor Veltar noticed the unusual tension in his classroom as soon as he entered. His students sat quietly, but there was an energy in the air that hadn't been there before. Many eyes were focused on Jake Martinez, who sat in his usual spot, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Today we will continue our study of predators," Professor Veltar announced, settling behind his desk. "I understand there was some discussion yesterday about aquatic hunters." Zixara immediately raised her hand. "Professor, Jake mentioned creatures called sharks from his homeworld. We would like to learn more about them." Professor Veltar's ancient eyes turned to Jake with interest. "Indeed. Please, Jake, share what you know about these sharks." Jake shifted in his seat, aware that every student in the room was watching him. He had hoped to avoid this conversation, but there was no escaping it now. "Well," Jake began slowly, "sharks are fish, predatory fish. They live in most of Earth's oceans." "How large are they?" Pipka asked from her tiny chair. Jake thought about how to explain. "It depends on the species. Some are small, maybe 2 or 3 feet long, but great white sharks can grow to about 20 feet. The classroom was dead silent. Jake could see his classmates trying to imagine a 20-foot predator swimming in the same water where humans went for fun. 20 feet, Thrum repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is longer than I am tall." "Yeah, they're pretty big," Jake said. "But size isn't really what makes them dangerous. They're perfectly designed hunters. They have rows of teeth, and when one breaks off, another one grows in to replace it. A single shark can go through thousands of teeth in its lifetime." Zixara's crystal body flickered rapidly, a sign of extreme distress. "Thousands of teeth? They can smell blood in the water from incredible distances," Jake continued, starting to get caught up in the explanation. "Some species can detect a single drop of blood in 25 gallons of water, and they can sense electrical fields from other animals' heartbeats." Professor Veltar leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Fascinating. How do humans coexist with such efficient predators?" Jake paused, realizing how his next words would sound. "Well, we swim in the same water, but shark attacks are actually pretty rare. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than attacked by a shark." "But attacks do happen," Thrum said. "Sometimes," Jake admitted. "Great whites are ambush predators. They attack from below, launching themselves completely out of the water to catch prey. The force of their bite can cut a seal in half." Several students made sounds of distress. Pipka had covered her eyes with her tiny paws. "And yet humans enter this environment voluntarily?" Professor Veltar asked. "Every day," Jake said. "Surfing is really popular. People paddle out on boards and ride waves, sometimes in areas where sharks are known to hunt. They know sharks are there and they still go in the water?" Zixara's voice was barely audible. Jake nodded. "Some people even cage dive with great whites. They get in metal cages and go underwater to observe them up close." The room erupted in gasps and shocked whispers. Professor Veltar had to call for quiet several times. "For what purpose?" the professor asked when order was restored. "Tourism, mostly. People think it's exciting. There are whole television programs dedicated to sharks. Shark Week is really popular on Earth." "Your people celebrate these predators?" Thrum asked in disbelief. "We respect them," Jake said. "They're amazing creatures. They've been around for over 400 million years, basically unchanged. They survived whatever killed the dinosaurs. They're living fossils." Professor Veltar's tentacles moved rapidly as he took notes. 400 million years. That predates most known civilizations in the galaxy. "Great whites aren't even the most dangerous ones," Jake continued, not noticing how his words were affecting his classmates. "Tiger sharks will eat almost anything. They've found license plates and tires in their stomachs. Bull sharks are probably responsible for most attacks on humans because they can swim in both salt and fresh water. They've been found in rivers hundreds of miles from the ocean." Pipka whimpered softly. "They leave the ocean?" "Bull sharks are really aggressive too," Jake said. "They have one of the strongest bite forces of any shark. And hammerhead sharks hunt in schools sometimes, working together like a pack." "There are different types of these creatures?" Zixara asked. "Over 400 species," Jake said. "The biggest shark that ever lived was called Megalodon. It went extinct millions of years ago, but it was about 60 feet long. Its teeth were the size of your hand." The silence that followed was complete. Even Professor Veltar seemed stunned by this information. These megalodons, the professor said slowly. They no longer exist? Right, they're extinct. Probably couldn't find enough food when the climate changed. What did they eat? Thrum asked, though he sounded like he regretted the question. Whales, mostly. They could bite a small whale in half. Professor Veltar stood up slowly, his old body moving carefully. Jake, let me understand this correctly. Your species regularly enters an environment containing hundreds of species of predators that have remained essentially unchanged for 400 million years. Some of these creatures can grow to 20 feet in length, can detect the smallest amounts of blood from great distances, and can launch themselves completely out of the water to attack prey. That's right, Jake said. And humans consider this normal recreation? Jake nodded. Swimming, surfing, diving, boating, ocean sports are really popular. How? Zixara whispered. Did your species survive long enough to develop space travel? Jake looked around the room at his classmates' terrified faces and realized he had fundamentally changed how they saw both him and humanity. They were no longer looking at him as the soft, harmless human they had known for months. We learned to be careful, Jake said simply, and we learned to be tougher than the things trying to eat us. Professor Veltar made a note on his tablet, with a shaking tentacle. I believe we need to dedicate several more lessons to Earth's ecosystem. This is clearly more complex than our initial assessment suggested. As the class ended, students filed out quietly, many of them casting nervous glances at Jake as they passed. The casual, friendly human they thought they knew had just revealed himself to be something far more complicated. Jake packed his materials slowly, aware that word of today's lesson would spread quickly through the academy. His quiet life as a unremarkable exchange student was probably over. Pipka approached his desk hesitantly. Jake, she said in her tiny voice, are there dangerous creatures on land too? Jake looked down at his small friend and realized that the sharks were just the beginning of the conversation they were going to have about his world. Yeah, he said quietly. There are. Word traveled fast through Kepler Station. By the next morning, Jake could feel alien eyes following him as he walked through the corridors. Students he had never spoken to before whispered to each other as he passed. The quiet human who had blended into the background for months was suddenly the most talked about being at the academy. During lunch, Jake found himself surrounded by a much larger group than usual. Besides his regular friends, students from other classes had joined them. Lisa Park, a human engineering student, and Danny O'Connor from the diplomatic program sat nearby, looking just as uncomfortable as Jake felt. Is it true about the sharks? Asked Kethlo, a tall insect-like student from the hive worlds. 20 feet long with rows of teeth? Jake nodded, taking a bite of his sandwich. That's accurate. But surely the sharks are the worst predators in your oceans, said Velnith, a floating gas being whose voice came through a translation device. Nothing could be more dangerous than what you described yesterday. Lisa and Danny exchanged a look. Jake realized he was about to shatter even more illusions about Earth. Well, actually, Jake said slowly, sharks aren't really the most dangerous things in the ocean. The table went quiet. Even students from other tables had stopped eating to listen. There are box jellyfish, Lisa said, joining the conversation. They look like clear floating boxes with long tentacles. Beautiful, really. But their venom can kill a human in minutes. Minutes? Pipka squeaked. The pain is supposed to be so bad that people go into shock before the venom even kills them, Danny added helpfully. Zixara's crystal form had gone completely transparent again. Your oceans contain creatures that can kill in minutes? There are also blue-ringed octopi, Jake said. They're really small, about the size of your fist. Pretty little things with bright blue rings, but they have a neurotoxin that paralyzes you. There's no antidote. And saltwater crocodiles, Lisa continued. They can grow up to 23 feet long and have the strongest bite force on the planet, stronger than any shark. Thrum made a choking sound. 23 feet? With the strongest bite force? They're ambush predators too, Danny said. They hide in water that looks empty and safe, then explode out to grab prey. They can launch their entire body out of the water. Humans swim in water with these creatures? Kethlo asked in disbelief. Every day, Jake confirmed. In Australia, people swim at beaches where saltwater crocodiles are known to hunt. There are warning signs, but people still go swimming. Professor Veltar appeared at their table, having overheard the conversation. Jake, may I ask how humans justify recreational activities in such dangerous environments? Jake thought about how to explain. Well, the ocean is really big. The chances of running into something dangerous are pretty small. And we have safety measures, lifeguards, shark nets, warning systems. But accidents happen, the professor pressed. Sometimes, Jake admitted. But we accept that risk because the ocean is also really beautiful and fun. You accept the risk of death for fun? Felnith's translation device crackled with static as if struggling to process the concept. I guess when you put it that way it sounds crazy, Lisa said with a small laugh. But that's just normal life on Earth. Zixara leaned forward, her form flickering between colors. Surely on land, away from these ocean predators, humans are safe. The three humans looked at each other. Jake could see his friends' hope in their faces, their desperate need to believe that some part of Earth was safe and normal. Well, Jake said carefully, land has its own challenges. Such as? Professor Veltar asked, his scientific curiosity overriding his growing alarm. Bears, Danny said. Grizzly bears can weigh over 800 pounds and run 30 miles per hour. They can stand 10 feet tall on their hind legs. Polar bears are even bigger, Lisa added. They actively hunt humans. They're one of the few predators on Earth that see humans as food. Pipka had covered her face with her paws again. How fast can humans run? Maybe 15 miles per hour, Jake said. If we're in really good shape. So these bears are twice as fast as humans? Thrum asked. At least, Jake confirmed. There are also big cats, mountain lions, leopards, jaguars. They're ambush predators that can jump 15 feet vertically and 40 feet horizontally. Tigers are the biggest, Danny said. Siberian tigers can weigh over 600 pounds. They're solitary hunters, but they're smart enough to stalk humans for days. Professor Veltar was taking notes frantically. And humans coexist with these creatures how? We're careful, Lisa said. When we go camping or hiking in areas where big predators live, we take precautions. We make noise so we don't surprise them, we store food properly, we carry bear spray. You willingly enter their territories? Kethilo asked. Camping is really popular on Earth, Jake said. Millions of people go camping every year in areas where bears and mountain lions live. For recreation, Professor Veltar said slowly. It's fun, Danny said with a shrug. Being in nature, sitting around a campfire, sleeping under the stars. What about venomous creatures? Zixara asked weakly. Jake winced. There are a lot of those. Rattlesnakes, coral snakes, black widow spiders, brown recluse spiders. In Australia, they have funnel web spiders whose bite can kill you in 15 minutes. And cobras, Lisa added. King cobras can rear up 6 feet tall and their bite delivers enough venom to kill an elephant. Elephants? Pipka whispered. Oh, elephants can be dangerous too, Danny said. They kill more people in Africa than lions do. They're really smart. And they remember grudges. The table was silent for a long moment. Jake could see his alien friends trying to process the idea that Earth was filled with creatures that could kill humans in dozens of different ways. How? Zixara finally asked. Did your species survive long enough to develop civilization? The question hung in the air. Jake looked around at the faces staring at him, all waiting for an answer that would make sense of how humans could possibly thrive on such a deadly world. We became tougher than everything else, Jake said simply. We learned to use tools, to work together, to outsmart the things that wanted to eat us. We didn't just survive our world, we conquered it. Conquered it? Professor Veltar repeated. Jake nodded. Humans are the apex predator on Earth now. We're at the top of the food chain. The silence that followed was profound. Jake could see understanding dawning in his friend's eyes. The quiet, gentle human they had known for months wasn't soft at all. He was a survivor from a world that had tried to kill his species for millions of years. And somehow, against all odds, humans had won. The weeks following Jake's revelations changed everything at Kepler Station. Students who had barely noticed the quiet human exchange student now watched him with a mixture of fascination and nervous respect. The Academy's biology department had dedicated an entire month to studying Earth's ecosystem, and Professor Veltar had requested additional materials from Earth's universities. Jake sat in the same back row seat he had occupied for months, but the dynamic in the classroom was completely different. Where once his classmates had seemed to forget he was there, now they hung on his every word. Today's lesson was about persistence hunting, and Jake found himself once again at the center of attention. "Explain to us again how this works, Professor," Veltar said, his ancient eyes focused intently on Jake. "Your ancestors hunted by running?" Jake nodded. "Persistence hunting. Early humans would pick out an animal, like an antelope, and just start jogging after it. The animal would run away really fast, but humans would keep following at a steady pace. But surely the prey would escape," Zixara said. Her crystal form had returned to its normal colors, though she still seemed nervous around Jake. "That's what the animal would think too," Jake said. "It would run until it felt safe, then stop to rest. But humans would still be coming. The animal would run again, rest again, but the humans never stopped. They would track the animal for hours, sometimes days, until it was too exhausted to run anymore." Thrum shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Humans would hunt for days without stopping? Our ancestors could run for hours without getting tired," Jake explained. "We sweat to cool down, which means we don't overheat like most animals do. We can keep going when other creatures have to stop and pant." Professor Veltar made notes on his tablet. "This explains the unusual human physique. Long legs, efficient, cooling systems, high endurance. There are still humans who do ultramarathons," Lisa Park added from her seat nearby. "Races that are 100 miles or more. Some people run for 24 hours straight." The classroom fell silent. Pipka raised a tiny paw. "Humans can run for an entire day?" "The record for running without stopping is over 11 days, Danny O'Connor said helpfully. Several students made sounds of distress. The idea of being hunted by something that could run for 11 days straight was clearly terrifying to them. "But this was just early humans, correct?" asked Kethlo hopefully. "Modern humans no longer hunt this way?" Jake thought about how to answer. "Well, we don't need to hunt for food anymore, but humans still do endurance sports for fun. Marathons, triathlons, Ironman competitions." "What is an Ironman competition?" Professor Veltar asked. "You swim for about 2.5 miles, then bike for over 100 miles, then run a full marathon," Jake said. "All in the same day." "For recreation," the professor said slowly. "People train for years to compete in them," Lisa said. "It's considered a great achievement." Professor Veltar stood up and began pacing, his tentacles waving, as he processed this information. "Let me understand the full picture. Humans evolved on a world filled with predators that could kill them in numerous ways. To survive, they became endurance hunters capable of pursuing prey for days without rest. They developed the ability to continue functioning even when injured, and they learned to work together in groups to overcome larger, stronger predators." "That's about right," Jake said. "And now, despite having technology that makes hunting unnecessary, humans continue to engage in extreme physical challenges that would be considered torture by most galactic species. We call it exercise," Danny said with a grin. Zixara leaned forward. "Jake, when you first arrived here, you seemed so calm about everything. Even when emergencies happened at the station, you never seemed worried. Is this because of your world?" Jake considered the question. "I guess when you grow up, on a planet where there are thousands of ways to die, the problems we have here don't seem that scary. Last month," Thrum said slowly, "when the station's gravity generator failed and we were all floating around in panic, you helped organize the emergency response. You seemed almost bored. Floating in zero gravity isn't really dangerous if you know what you're doing," Jake said. It's not like being charged by a bear or caught in a riptide. Professor Veltar stopped pacing and stared at Jake. You have personal experience with these situations? I've done a lot of camping and hiking, Jake said. My family loves the outdoors. We've had a few close calls over the years, but that's just part of spending time in nature on Earth. The professor's tentacles trembled slightly. Close calls with apex predators are considered normal family activities. My little sister Amy is 12 and she's already been whitewater rafting, rock climbing, and camping in bear country, Jake said proudly. Last summer she caught her first fish with her bare hands. Pipka made a small squeaking sound. Your 12-year-old sister catches predatory fish with her hands? They weren't predatory fish, Jake laughed. Just trout. Though I guess from your perspective, any fish that eats other fish is probably a predator. How big are trout? Velnith asked through his translation device. Maybe a foot long. Pretty harmless. The alien students exchanged glances. To them, a foot-long predatory fish was probably terrifying, but Jake's sister caught them for fun. Professor Veltar returned to his desk and pulled up a holographic display of human anatomy. I am beginning to understand why humans seem so adaptable to different environments. Your species was forged by a world that demanded constant adaptation or death. We're good at dealing with problems, Jake agreed. When you've spent millions of years figuring out how to survive on Earth, most other challenges seem manageable. Is this why humans volunteer for the most dangerous jobs in space? Asked a student Jake didn't recognize. Deep space exploration, first contact missions, asteroid mining? Jake shrugged. Dangerous is relative. Going to an unexplored planet might be risky, but it's probably safer than hiking in Alaska or swimming in Australia. Your species considers space exploration less dangerous than recreation on your homeworld, Professor Veltar said, more to himself than to the class. I guess when you put it that way, yeah, Jake said. The professor looked around the classroom at his students' faces. I believe we have learned something important here. We have been classifying humans as a peaceful, cooperative species, which is correct. But we failed to understand that they are peaceful and cooperative apex predators from a death world. Jake felt uncomfortable being talked about like he wasn't there, but he understood what the professor meant. We're not trying to be scary, he said. We just want to get along with everyone. Which makes you more remarkable, not less, Professor Veltar said. A species that could dominate through force chooses instead to explore, to learn, to make friends. As the class ended, students filed out quietly, many of them nodding respectfully to Jake as they passed. The change in their behavior was obvious. They no longer saw him as harmless Jake from the soft species. Now they understood he was Jake from Earth, survivor of a world that had tried to kill his ancestors for millions of years. That evening, Jake video called his family back on Earth. His parents asked about his classes, and his sister Amy chatted excitedly about her upcoming camping trip to Yellowstone. Oh, and Jake, Amy said. I learned to surf last weekend. Dad says next month we can try shark cage diving. Jake laughed, knowing that if his alien friends could hear this conversation, they would probably faint. A 12-year-old human planning to voluntarily enter a cage surrounded by apex predators was just another normal weekend activity on Earth. As he ended the call and looked out at the peaceful, artificial environment of Kepler Station, Jake realized something. For the first time in his life, he was living somewhere truly safe. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had to travel to the stars to find a world without predators. He found himself missing home, missing the beautiful, terrible ocean where sharks swam and the mountains where bears roamed. Earth was dangerous, but it was also alive in a way that no artificial station could ever be. Jake smiled and returned to his homework, aware that across the galaxy, the reputation of humanity was quietly changing. They were no longer seen as the soft ones. Now they were known as the friendly apex predators from the death world called Earth, and somehow that felt exactly right.